A little bit of background on Texas Water Trade. As I mentioned, we are a statewide nonprofit that's just a little over a year old. We were created for the purposes that are outlined here. It's all oriented around ensuring that Texas, as we grow, is able to provide water both for all of our municipal, industrial, agricultural needs, but also able to manage our water resources in ways that keeps water in streams for the health of our rivers and our bays and estuaries. And in so doing, our purpose is to help others in the space to develop transactions for the purpose of providing environmental flows, environmental water, where it is appropriate, where there's not capacity on the ground for us to be actually acquiring water ourselves for that purpose and to be able to take a position in a voluntary transaction. And the third is to account for the outcomes of those deals. Our objective is to be able to provide sufficient flows to sustain ecological health and support water reliability within basins, and to be able to do that not through kind of regulatory means, but rather through the primary means that the Texas state legislature has been expressing since the 1980s, which is voluntary market transactions. Despite Texas having that kind of preferred approach to managing the challenges of water availability, Texas as a state has only seen about 1% of the environmental water trades that other states in the West have seen. So maybe around $1 million worth of water rights that have been leased or purchased here in the state of Texas for the purpose of environmental flows, compared to about $100 million in states like Oregon, California, Nevada. In those other states, a quarter of all water that is purchased either temporarily through leasing arrangements or permanently through outright acquisition of water rights has been for the purposes of environmental water. So a quarter of all trading activity in the water markets. It's a substantial portion of the water market overall, and we think that there's a lot of room to grow that space here in Texas, and that was why we were created. So how does this relate to groundwater conservation districts? One, I'll say, if you look at other places in the West, and I'll talk about one program in particular that we've been designing this program, Texas Water Market Makers, around, many of those arrangements with water users are on the surface water side of the kind of allocation ledger, but there are many that are with groundwater users. And so there's an opportunity through both hydrological and regulatory systems for groundwater districts that may be in basins that are experiencing conflict or water availability challenges related to alluvial wells. So this is the organizational purpose I was just describing. Talking a little bit about the relevance in places where there might be conflict around groundwater surface water use as it relates to water availability. And that's true as well in places where there's well-known spring contributions to base flow in rivers, or that provide important cultural or ecological flows. So that this might be places where you have endangered species, or where there's been some modeling and observations that would indicate that there's important groundwater features that are providing inflows into surface features. This is a photo of one of the springs in the Comanche Springs complex, which is one of the places where we've been working on these sorts of voluntary water transactions. This is showing a spring that most of us know as dry, actually with water in it, which happens a certain portion of the year. So those are a couple of the sorts of places where, especially where there's a strong surface water groundwater connection, we imagine that there is an opportunity for groundwater conservation districts potentially to be interested in the way that voluntary transactions might help to create solutions where none readily exist in a purely regulatory framework. So I want to talk a little bit about the way that transactions actually help to advance solutions. And in doing so, want to just make sure that we're all on the same page. Often when we talk about environmental water transactions, people immediately think that what we're talking about is the outright severance of water rights from the landowner's property, the permanent acquisition of water rights. And that's certainly the way that water transactions can look. But in the slide that follows this, you'll see that that's only a portion of the way that voluntary agreements are constructed between those who hold water rights and those who would like to make water available for environmental flows. So beyond just the terms of a contract, I could outright purchase a water right. I could outright lease a water right and say, I will just be using the water for the purposes of keeping water in stream. I could be creating an agreement with a groundwater user in which they agree for a certain period of time to forbear pumping entirely and fallow land for the purposes of keeping that groundwater in a springs contributing zone, let's say. But there's also a lot of opportunities that have been developed in other places in the West where you've seen hundreds of millions of dollars traded and thousands of stream miles restored, where it's actually long-term investment in on-farm upgrades, maybe switching producers from flood irrigation to pivot, deploying soil moisture centers. It could be payments to producers to shift the type of crops that they grow and making it worth their while to do that. So sometimes it's the way that the voluntary agreement is developed is by creating other financial incentives for the producer in the form of actual infrastructure and kind of durable assets versus just a payment. There's been a lot of work done with irrigation districts, as an example, to line canals and to create other improvements that reduce water loss from a system in exchange for that water being agreed to be kept in stream in terms of the amount of water savings over the duration of the lifetime of that project that was funded. So there's lots of different shapes that this can take. I mentioned that there are places in the West where there have been projects developed over the span of years that have resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars spent and thousands of stream miles restored. One of the great examples of this is in the Columbia Basin, which is a very large river basin, roughly the same size as the state of Texas, that goes across 4 states in the Pacific Northwest. This is a system where you have a federal hydropower installation that was subject to endangered species findings related to salmon and trout. It then spurred a commitment of many millions of dollars every year into a variety of habitat improvement projects for those species. Part of that agreement was for water transactions. In this particular geography, the Bonneville Power Administration has provided $6 million a year in funding for water rights transactions. On top of that, they've also consistently funded entities on the ground, conservation groups and state agencies, some of which in those states are the only entities that can hold surface water rights for in-stream flows, which is a beneficial use, and providing technical support for those entities to be able to develop environmental water trades. This just represents the growth of that program from 2003 in its inception to 2017. So it's a few years old at this point, but you can see that over that period of time, they are now at a point where on an annual basis, through voluntary contracts, they have more than 160,000 acre feet a year of water that is being kept in stream. Some of these agreements are very long-term, so they might be dated as 20 or 30-year agreements. Some of them are permanent, in which that perhaps an irrigation district or a water rights holder that initially entered in, let's say in the 2003-2004 time period, that light blue indicating a leasing arrangement and a temporary agreement, ultimately ended up permanently transferring that water right. And so the darker blue, you see the growth of those permanent acquisitions over time. So that just gives you an example of how substantial these marketplaces can grow to become with the right amount of support and investment. And that is trying to create the opportunity for that same level of commitment of resources especially in the early stages, technical resources to allow trades to be developed by entities on the ground is why Texas Water Trade was created in 2019, and it is the purpose of the Texas Water Market Makers program that we announced about 2 weeks ago on February 26th, and for which we have a current funding opportunity that's out there available for consideration by nonprofit entities, which could be land trusts, land conservancies. It could be groundwater conservation districts or even irrigation districts who compete to receive these technical resources. So what is Water Market Makers? This is a program that we are inviting entities to compete for. It will be a 2-year program. Entities that are selected and announced in May of this year will have 2 years in which we will be contracting with experts in the field who can provide them support at no cost to them in valuing water rights or water agreements, developing hydrological models that would help them identify the type of in-stream flow benefits that may be created through an agreement with a water right user. So that could be modeling the benefits of a lease of water rights, including groundwater. It could be modeling the sorts of in-stream flows that would result from an agreement with a producer to upgrade their system on their farm and leave a portion of the water that's saved in stream in certain periods of the year. We will provide access to legal expertise to evaluate the changes that would need to be created to permits to be able to enable those agreements to actually have durability in terms of water management within the basin. And over that 2-year period, really to think about how does the needs of that entity end up, kind of responding to the way that voluntary transactions could help to shape those needs. What are the unique challenges? What are the unique kind of assets that that entity might have at its disposal, whether that's existing science, rules or contemplated management activities that would seem to support these sorts of engagements. How do we help to gain access to funding to implement? I'm happy to say that we just helped the Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District apply for its first grant with the Texas Water Development Board for the Ag Conservation Program to fund a lot of these on-farm improvement concepts that we've talked about today, and to really use their science in a way that could help to restore some groundwater surface water connectivity in that place. So those are the sorts of things that over a 2-year period we want to do, with the idea being that Texas is far too large for any one entity to try to develop enough deals to keep water in stream and do it in a way that creates real measurable outcomes. We need to provide the resources to the people on the ground with those relationships to do that. So in terms of that RFQ I mentioned earlier, it was announced February 26th at the Texas Land Conservation Conference. The RFQ responses are due on April 10th, so it's kind of around the bend, but we did try to make the RFQ fairly straightforward in terms of the sorts of questions that we ask and the information that would need to be provided. We have to apply for grants all the time, and we were really looking through this at this through the lens of how do we reduce people's burdens. And then in late April, Texas Water Trade will be notifying those respondents who are successful in selection. The selection process will be informed by our advisory council, which includes individuals from the Nature Conservancy, from the Texas Water Development Board, from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and who've thought about, what would it take to have an entity that's positioned to really do this work. They'll be helping us choose the right organizations to embark on this first cohort with. And then announcing in the middle of May at the River Rally and holding our first 101 with those market makers. I mentioned earlier, we'll be doing a lot of deep dives one-on-one with the organizations that are selected, but we also think it's really important to build a community of practitioners who can help each other in this work. And so that May 15th meeting will also be an opportunity for the selected entities to get to know each other and understand their respective priorities and challenges and just try to build some community. So you may be wondering, this all sounds great. Where does the money come from? We do not have, unfortunately, a Bonneville Power Administration that's spitting out $6 million a year for these purposes here in Texas. But we think that we do have significant resources that are as of yet untapped to enable this vision of voluntary markets creating solutions on the ground. So these are just some of those untapped resources. I mentioned earlier the Ag Conservation Program. Some of your districts may actually have taken money down from this program before. You may know that as of until last year, it was about a $600,000 grant program through the Water Development Board. As of this year, it's now doubled to $1.2 million available per year. That was the legislature that authorized that doubling in funding availability. And it's only available to political subdivisions like groundwater conservation districts, irrigation districts, counties. So it's an amazing program. We, in the Comanche Springs example, are hoping to leverage it against another pending request we have in front of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This is the USDA. They have a range of programs that primarily provide funding to landowners in the field, and it's about $300 million a year nationally that's available for those sorts of programs. So substantial and renewable pot of funding. Beyond that, between the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and their Water Smart program, another relatively untapped opportunity here in the state of Texas, communities in the Panhandle and the Rio Grande Valley have gotten pretty good at pulling those resources down. I'm pleased to say we just got our first commitment of funding from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation for their applied science program, but they fund infrastructure as well, and it makes it an interesting resource to think about. We are in conversations with entities that may have to line up mitigation opportunities for aquatic organisms like freshwater mussels. Had somebody at the Texas Land Conservation Conference from TxDOT, the Department of Transportation, ask whether or not we'd talk to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the possibility of creating credits that could allow a TxDOT sort of entity or a common carrier, if you think about oil and gas pipelines and being another developer that requires mitigation credits, depending upon where a project might be. We are interested as an organization in creating more deal flow and creating the structure around which credits could be available to those entities for aquatic species. We have state infrastructure funds that are significant and which we know are authorized for these purposes but have not been used as such. And then on the corporate water side, there's a surprising number of corporations in Texas that have made commitments to their shareholders to restore all of their water that they demand in their operations within Texas. So most recently, we were contacted by a very large tech company with an RFI looking for water replenishment projects in the San Antonio area. And we're looking at opportunities to cooperate with entities in some of those basins to pull down what can be hundreds of thousands of dollars of funding in a single pop from a corporate that's looking for projects on the ground to meet those commitments for their shareholders. On top of that, we are excited to be able to share that we've raised our first $500,000 for a fund specifically dedicated to environmental transactions that we will be administering as Texas Water Trade. This is our Texas Flows Fund. We have a goal by 2021, end of 2021, to have leveraged this to enable $2 million worth of environmental water trades in the state of Texas by leveraging these funds and others that we may raise against the resources that we just described. And so that will be available in a different competitive program. Our water market makers, we hope to get into a position where they will be able to compete for projects that they are developing through this fund, but we're also going to make it available more broadly for any nonprofit entity with an environmental water transaction that can create quantifiable outcomes. So that's the end of my formal presentation. I would love to invite questions that you may have.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat quite yet. We'll give it a few minutes and see if anyone comes up with something.
Sure thing. while y'all are thinking about your questions, it's worth noting that if you as a groundwater district may not be at a point where you feel like you and your board are ready to compete to be a water market maker, but there's an interest in how environmental water transactions may help to unlock opportunities that are challenging, that are right now, really just described as challenges. We would love to hear from you directly, and just think through what that might mean for the market makers with whom we do work, who are ready to kind of take on the process of developing transactions. And that sort of relationship can look like a lot of different things. In some places, it might just be data sharing. It could be looking at opportunities to fund programs that are run through the Groundwater Conservation District, being able to take advantage of funding that's only available to political subdivisions, like that agricultural conservation program. So it doesn't have to be necessarily the GCD becoming the market maker, but we designed it to be available for that purpose in case there is a GCD who thinks that this is right for them. We're interested in hearing your story and thinking about what that might look like.
It looks like you must have done an excellent job because nobody has any questions. So what we'll do is we will make this available. It'll go out in our weekly updates. We'll include the recording and make sure to also include the link to your website and the RFP so that if anyone does have any questions, they definitely know where to find you.
That's great. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you have any questions, even if you just, are still trying to put the pieces together and can't figure out what the whole thing is about. There's no question that's too basic. We're really looking forward to hearing what the field thinks is possible and to provide the funding resources that we've raised to make good ideas touch down on Earth. So get in touch with me.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlene. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.